Bryce, she tried to find a way to explain her decision to him and drew a complete blank. After 4 months of constant and inexplicable rejection, I gave up on trying to reach you. By that point, I didn't think that you deserved to have the baby or me in your life. I wanted to move on and couldn't do so with your money. I needed to do it on my own, without being beholden to the man who had made it clear that he didn't want anything to do with us. I didn't feel entitled to your money after making that decision. You didn't feel entitled to it? Bryce latched onto those words, obviously dismissing the rest of what she had said. To the father of your child's money? I don't even know how to respond to that, Bronwyn. You may not have felt entitled to it, but Kayla certainly was, and is, entitled to it. You could have set aside your pettiness and considered her in all of this. Oh, please just stop throwing Kayla in my face. I did everything I could for her. I gave her the best I could afford after you kicked us out. How was I supposed to know you'd have this turnaround where the baby was concerned? As far as I knew, you didn't want her and didn't think that she was entitled to anything you had. She didn't want for anything. Her clothes may not have had designer tags and her toys may have been secondhand, but my baby was well loved and well taken care of. Don't you dare imply anything else. More interminably silent, staring from him, but she refused to lower her eyes, refused to be intimidated or cowed by him. Instead, she met his inscrutable gaze head-on, with chin tilted defiantly, eyes sparking, and fists clenched. She looked like a feral cat ready to defend herself and her baby against any and all threats. What time are you meeting Alice? The question threw her completely, and she blinked in astonishment, surprised and relieved that he had let it drop. She checked her watch. In about half an hour, she told him. You will come back? Not understanding the question, she merely stared at him confusedly for a few moments. What? You won't run off again, he rephrased, and she reeled in shock at the depth of vulnerability and insecurity his question had revealed. And no. Michaela was all she managed, and he nodded shortly, realizing that she would never leave without her daughter. If not for Michaela, he seemed to ask the question before he could stop himself, and in doing so, clearly revealed a lot more than he had ever intended to reveal. Would you come back? She hesitated, her eyes lowered as she pondered the question, and seeing the uncertainty on her face, Bryce made a slight movement with his hand. Forget it, he snapped, before she could even think about formulating a response. It was a stupid question, and it's really not that important. As long as you don't leave with my daughter, I don't give a damn what you do. Somehow the words sounded hollow and untrue, ringing with bravado and not much conviction. They avoided each other's eyes, each afraid of the truth they might spy in the other's gaze. I have to go, she muttered evasively, getting up from the chair. He jumped up too and caught her arm to halt her progress. Wait. She stood quietly in his grasp, her eyes searching his harsh features warily. He looked moody and uncertain, not at all sure of what he wanted to say or even why he'd halted her progress. I don't want you to go by yourself, he said, almost reluctantly. I want one of the security team to go with. Bronwyn frowned at that. She had always hated the discreet security detail that had followed them just about everywhere after they had first gotten married and had complained about it so much that he had cut her personal detail down to one supposedly unobtrusive guard to keep her happy. Bronwyn had agreed to the compromise because the one guy had been better than a team, but she had never felt comfortable with what she had always felt was a blatant display of wealth. Bryce, I don't want to have some gorilla following me around all afternoon. She snapped, and his lips tightened. I'll ask Cal to take care of the matter personally. Cal was his head of security and Bronwyn had always liked the quiet man who read Shakespearean sonnets in his spare time. She hadn't really seen him since her return. She was relieved to learn that he still worked for Bryce, since she had feared that she might have gotten him into trouble after instructing him to take that fateful night off 2 years ago. She had wanted a private and romantic evening with her husband and had dismissed the entire staff. She knew that it was probably one of the only reasons she had been able to disappear so completely. Cal had left only a skeleton staff on duty that night. Her personal guard, not expecting her to leave the house that night, had also been given the night off. "I'm glad Cal still works for you," she said, all the heat fleeing from her voice and expression. "He's been acting as my personal guard," Bryce said before making an odd sound in the back of his throat. "You still have my numbers, right?" he continued hesitantly, and she nodded again. "If you need anything, or if you feel ill, call me." "Bryce." She smiled reassuringly up into his eyes. "I'm fine, but in the unlikely event of that status quo changing, I'll be sure to give you a call." His eyes frosted over. "Don't mock me, Bronwyn," he said coldly, and she shook her head, alarmed that he had misread her humor. "I wasn't," she assured gently, lifting her hand to cup his jaw. "I'll be fine, but I promise to call you if I feel ill." He stepped away from her soft hand, leaving it hovering in midair. He continued to look down at her for a few long moments. "I'll tell Cal to meet you in the garage. Let him do the driving," he said bossily before swiveling on his heel and leaving the room. Bronwyn sighed despondently and stared after him for one long, wistful moment before straightening her shoulders and leaving too. Alice met her at the restaurant entrance with a warm hug and a smile. Her mischievously sparkling eyes traveled past Bronwyn's shoulder to where Cal stood hovering in the background, before tossing a conspiratorial glance back over her own narrow shoulder. When Bronwyn saw a large man, similarly dressed in black suit and dark glasses, standing a little off to the side, desperately striving to look unobtrusive behind Alice, she laughed in genuine amusement. "All the cool kids have one these days," Alice wisecracked cheerfully, her expression so comical that it set Bronwyn off again. "Where's Tristan?" Bronwyn asked Alice after their initial warm greetings. "I told Pierre that this was a ladies' afternoon and as such he had to take Tristan to the office with him." She grinned. He was a bit reluctant. He loves having the baby around, but Tristan has this nasty habit of chewing important documents. Pierre still shudders every time he thinks of a certain document that got gummed just minutes before he had to hand it back to the legal department. The way he tells it, he had no option but to give it back as is. He made no comment about the drool, and as such none of the legal team had the courage to say anything either. They merely retyped everything before sending it off. She laughed conspiratorially. According to Pierre, it was damned embarrassing. She imitated her husband's voice and accent perfectly, and Bronwyn's grin widened appreciatively. "Apparently he has an important meeting today, but I hardly ever get time to myself, so while he may grumble, he doesn't really mind. In fact, he'll never admit it, but he gets a total thrill out of having his son to himself for part of the day." "Well, I still feel a bit guilty about leaving Bryce with Kayla," Bronwyn admitted. "He's been remarkable with her, but I feel like he's been doing all the work." "So?" Alice interrupted coldly. "You have been doing all the work for the last 2 years, and you've paid for it with your health. It's time for Bryce to put in some hours. And you can't tell me he's not enjoying this time with her. He's getting to know his daughter, and from what I could see last night, he's totally in love with her." Bronwyn nodded with slight smile. "So no more guilt, just enjoy yourself. As far as I can tell, you haven't had too much fun over the last 2 years." Bronwyn's smile faded, and Alice shrugged, the gesture so Gallic, it could only have rubbed off on her from her husband. "I know nothing about your situation, Bronwyn," she said quietly. But Pierre's version of events, definitely gleaned from his friend, was so one-sided that I'd always vowed to reserve judgment until I met you. And there seems to be a whole lot that Bryce left out when he told Pierre his story. I mean, he had certainly never told Pierre that you were pregnant. I can't tell you how shocked Pierre was when he learned that you were back in Bryce's life and with a child." Bronwyn blinked stupidly at that. Pierre hadn't known about her pregnancy? She had a sudden vivid flashback of Rick in her room at the hospital. It hadn't really sunk in at the time. She had been frightened, panicky, and floating on a medicated cloud, but her brother-in-law had looked startled at Bryce's first mention of a child. How could Bryce not have told Rick or Pierre about their baby? Had he told his crack team of private investigators? It was a bizarre detail to leave out. If he really wanted to find her, why wouldn't he have told anybody about her pregnancy? Surely it would have made his search easier. Granted, some instinct had urged her to use her maternal grandmother's maiden name over the last 2 years, just in case Bryce decided that he wanted her baby and not her. It had been bothersome because she'd had to keep changing doctors and clinics. Nobody would have believed her forgotten ID story twice. Bronwyn? Alice's voice seemed to come from a great distance away, and Bronwyn had a hard time focusing on Alice again. "Are you okay?" Why wouldn't he have told Pierre or Rick about the baby? She mused aloud, and Alice frowned. "That's a good question," Alice murmured. "But one that only Bryce can provide the answer to." Bronwyn nodded absently, but found it hard to focus on anything else for the rest of the afternoon. She enrolled in the sign language classes after lunch. The clinic offered afternoon and evening classes, and Bronwyn opted to attend a day class once a week. She and Alice also arranged a standing lunch date on the day that she would attend the class, so every Tuesday? Same time and place. The other woman double-checked as they said their goodbyes a couple of hours later. "And next time, let's keep the husbands out of the conversation." "I'm sorry if I seemed a little distracted," Bron apologized quietly. "It's just, forget it, you and Bryce obviously still have a great deal to work out." Chapter 7. The house was in chaos when Bronwyn returned home half an hour later. Kayla was screaming her head off in the den while Bryce held her writhing little body in his arms as he frantically tried to soothe her. Celeste stood to the side, wringing her hands nervously, a concerned look on her plain face. "Oh my God. What's going on here?" Kayla's crying worsened when she heard her mother's voice. She managed to pull herself out of her father's arms and launched herself toward her mother, her unsteady gait nearly sending her off balance. "Mummy." "Kayla, ouch. Kayla, ouch, Mummy." Bronwyn sank to her knees, and her heart dropped like a stone when she registered the genuine fear and pain on her little girl's face. As the child crept into her mother's open arms and snuggled against her chest, Bronwyn allowed her furious eyes to meet Bryce's. His face had closed up like a shutter, a remote look in his eyes as he stood watching them, his hands thrust into his trouser pockets. "What did you do to her?" she hissed, her maternal instincts on full alert. "I trusted you to look after her and I come back to this?" Kayla had stopped her hysterical sobbing and was hiccuping into Bronwyn's chest, her tense little body relaxing as she clung to the familiar comfort her mother represented. Bryce's shadowed eyes revealed absolutely no emotion, his clenched jaw the only visible sign of his tension. She got up, Kayla in her arms, and advanced toward him, a stalking lioness intent on protecting her cub. "What happened here?" His eyes remained level, but he refused to say a word. "Bryce, answer me. She never cries like this unless she's hurt." "How did she get hurt?" His eyes flickered a little, as he cast an involuntary look down at the little girl who was staring up at him with huge, tear-drenched blue eyes. Her thumb was propped in her mouth and her breath still hitched. Bronwyn glanced over her daughter's little body, doing a damage assessment. Her eyes detected no visible signs of injury until she reached one plump little bare foot. Her big toe was bleeding and looked somewhat swollen. Bronwyn made a soft sound of dismay and lifted the foot to inspect it more closely. Fortunately, the damage seemed minimal, and judging from Kayla's ever-lessening sniffles, the immediate shock of pain had worn off already. As the haze of panic dissipated, Bronwyn began to recognize that the damage she had done by storming blindly into the fray may have been a lot worse than the injury to Kayla's toe. She had shown an appalling lack of trust by assuming Bryce had been responsible for the toddler's injury, and she was beginning to feel like an overprotective fool. Bryce, she began hesitantly, taking a step toward where he stood. He was as still and remote as a statue. He ignored her and swung on his heel to leave the room abruptly. Bronwyn made a dismayed little sound, and Kayla, her pain mostly forgotten already, dragged her thumb from her mouth to add her own opinion. "Daddy, go bye-bye," she observed solemnly before resting her head on Bronwyn's shoulder and sticking her thumb back into her mouth. "Yes," Bronwyn whispered, burying her face in her daughter's silky curls. "Daddy's gone away." But that wasn't entirely true. He hadn't left the house. She had heard his study door slam and knew that he was probably brooding in there. She knew that she would have to get to the bottom of things sooner rather than later, and also had the sinking feeling that she was the one who would have to make serious amends. She glanced over at the appalled Celeste and nodded down at the drowsy little girl in her arms. "I'll take care of her toe," she said hoarsely, and Celeste mumbled that she'd be in the kitchen. Bronwyn fussed over Kayla for a while, her mind on Bryce, while she kissed the toe of her now giggling baby all better and placed a cute Finding Nemo band-aid on the tiny cut. Kayla's eyelids started to droop after half an hour of cuddling and playing with her mother. It was way past time for her afternoon nap. Bronwyn carried her to the housekeeper in the kitchen. "Celeste, would you mind?" She left the question unfinished, and Celeste nodded immediately and bustled forward to take an unprotesting Kayla into her arms. Bronwyn dropped an affectionate kiss on the sleepy child's forehead before hurrying out of the room toward Bryce's study. With each heavy step she took, she felt more and more like Daniel preparing to beard the lion's den. When she reached the ominously shut study door, she paused to listen but couldn't hear a sound coming from behind the door. She cautiously knocked on the solid wood before berating herself for her thoughtless action. Now she faced an unfamiliar dilemma. Did she just enter? Or did she wait until he eventually came out on his own? She regarded the suddenly insurmountable obstacle of the door cautiously before deciding to take the bull by the horns and open the door. Bryce sat behind his huge desk, with his elbows resting on the gleaming wooden surface and his face buried in his hands. His large shoulders were shaking slightly. He looked terribly vulnerable, and in that moment Bronwyn felt like a voyeur of the worst kind. She cleared her throat to alert him of her presence and then swore softly beneath her breath when she realized that the gesture was as futile as her knock had been. "Bryce," again she swore, feeling like a complete idiot, and hesitantly took a few steps toward him, lifting her hand to his shoulder in the process. He leaped out of the chair like a scalded cat and swore furiously. He glared at her, looking a bit shaken and a lot furious. "Don't sneak up on me," he berated hoarsely. "I didn't," she protested, shocked by the near violence of his reaction. "I knocked, but you knocked?" His voice dripped with derision. "I can't hear, damn it." "Well, what was I supposed to do then?" she responded defensively. "There's a doorbell," he informed, calming down marginally, and she stared at him in confusion. "A doorbell? But how?" Her question trailed off when he pointed toward the lamp on his desk. "The lamp is rigged to flicker when the bell rings. It works for both the front door and the study door. 2 flickers for outside, 1 for inside." "Oh. That's quite clever," she murmured. impressed by the ingenious device and feeling like a complete idiot for not realizing sooner that the flickering lights that she had absently noticed intermittently since her return were not the result of an electrical fault as she had assumed. Clever, yes. He smiled humorlessly and practically sneered the words. It's a common enough device for the deaf. There are so many ways to make our lives as convenient as possible. Clever little toys that light up and vibrate, tablet computers and smartphones with face-to-face call capabilities, SMSs, and various other little gadgets designed to ease my life. Yet not one of these clever little toys would ever be able to alert me to the fact that my little girl is standing right behind me, trying to get my attention. Not one of them could prevent me from turning around and treading on her before I'm able to stop myself. Oh God! After her initial panic at finding Kayla in floods of tears and obvious pain, she had suspected that it might be something like this. Of course it was an accident, something that Bryce would tear himself up over, a situation that she had worsened with her stupid overreaction. His eyes were tormented, and she swallowed back a sob as she cupped his jaw in her slender hands. Bryce, she whispered, her eyes liquid with regret and sympathy. He saw nothing but the sympathy and mistook it for pity. He jerked away from her and turned his back on her. No, she moaned softly, not willing to allow him to close himself off when he was clearly in pain. She stepped around him and forced him to meet her eyes. Michaela and I are going to have to learn not to sneak up on you then, she told him firmly. You are not at fault here, Bryce, it was an accident. You've changed your tune rather quickly, he mocked, and she flushed. I overreacted, she conceded. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone off the deep end like that. I know that you would never intentionally hurt our daughter. Intentionally or not, I did hurt her, he pointed out harshly. And I can't promise that it won't happen again in the future. And she's frightened of me now. I don't think she's a baby, Bryce, Braun pointed out firmly. She was shocked and in pain, but she'll soon forget. Children are resilient and have a much larger capacity for forgiveness than we do. She has also learned her lesson, and I doubt she'll be coming up behind you without warning you in some way in the future. One thing about your daughter, she smiled fondly, she's a fast learner. She was crying so much, he remembered in a shaken voice. I couldn't make her stop. Her little face was so sad and confused. I felt like a monster. She took a step closer to him, her heart going out to him. Oh, Bryce, she began, not sure how to make this better. I'm so sorry. I don't need your pity, he snarled, as defensive and dangerous as a wounded animal. Bronwyn blinked, his abrupt mood swing throwing her completely off guard. I don't pity you, she denied, placing one tentative hand on his forearm, but he shrugged her off and signed something at her, glaring wildly while he did. I don't understand, she said helplessly, and he responded with another mutinous flurry of sign that left her completely adrift. His eyes were burning with anger and some other emotion that she could not define. Bryce, please, she begged, not sure why it mattered to her that she comfort him. Don't shut me out like this. He said something else, again with his hands, and then quite abruptly turned his back on her. Once again shutting her out as completely as he could. She sobbed a little before lifting a clenched fist to her lips and biting down on her knuckles, not sure how to deal with this. She stared at his broad, stiff back through burning eyes. She refused to let him do this. Bryce had always been much too good at shutting her out. After a bad day at work, he used to closet himself in his study and refused to speak to her about it until after it was resolved. She had never told him how much that had hurt her, and the one time she had dared mention it, he had quite condescendingly informed her that she wouldn't understand anyway and not to worry about it. That had made her so furious, but she had let it slide. She had let a lot of things slide back then, in an effort not to upset Bryce. But she wasn't that silly, spineless girl anymore, and she was determined not to let him shut her out again, not this time. Not when it was so important to their future as a functioning family. She threw back her shoulders resolutely before stepping around him again to meet his glare with a ferocious one of her own. She chose to ignore the scorching anger in his eyes. "I won't allow you to turn your back on me this time, Bryce. And I refuse to leave until you acknowledge me and we talk about this," she told him resolutely, and his lips tightened as he signed something particularly vicious looking back at her.